On the afternoon of October 7th, 1777, somewhere outside the small village of Saratoga in upstate New York, a furious Continental general mounted his horse and rode straight toward the sound of gunfire. He had no command. He had no orders. In fact, he had been explicitly told to stay away from the battle. Officially, Major General Benedict Arnold no longer commanded a single American soldier. Hours earlier, after a bitter argument with Horatio Gates, the commander of the Northern Army, Arnold had been stripped of authority and confined to camp. But while he sat idle, nearly 1,500 British troops under General John Burgoyne were advancing through the woods, searching for the weak point that might save an entire army from destruction. If they found it, Burgoyne could still break through, retreat north, and keep Britain's campaign alive. Arnold understood something almost nobody else did. The battle unfolding ahead was not just another clash of muskets. It was the last chance either army would get to decide the fate of the entire northern campaign. And within the next few hours, a general without an army would change the course of the American Revolution. To understand why one man was willing to disobey his own commander in the middle of the most important campaign of the war, we have to go back long before Saratoga became synonymous with victory. Benedict Arnold was born on January 14, 1741, in Norwich, Connecticut, into a family that once stood among the colony's wealthiest merchants. But prosperity proved fragile. His father slowly descended into alcoholism, wasting the family's fortune and eventually becoming a public embarrassment. Arnold watched respected neighbors cross the street to avoid his father. He saw creditors take what remained of their possessions. By the time Benedict reached adulthood, the proud Arnold name had become something people whispered with pity rather than respect. Loss followed loss. 3 of his siblings died from yellow fever before reaching adulthood. His mother, Hannah, exhausted by grief and financial collapse, died when Benedict was still a teenager. 2 years later, his father followed. At just 20 years old, Arnold had no inheritance worth mentioning, no influential family left to support him, and a determination that bordered on obsession. He would restore his family's reputation or die trying. Unlike many future Continental officers, Arnold did not begin his career as a soldier. He became a merchant. Working first as an apprentice apothecary before opening his own business in New Haven, he sold medicines, books, imported goods, and eventually expanded into Atlantic trade. He captained his own ships through the Caribbean, built commercial networks stretching from Connecticut to the West Indies, and developed a reputation that combined remarkable business instincts with an explosive temper. Friends admired his courage, rivals remembered his pride. Arnold rarely forgot an insult and almost never accepted one. That same personality shaped everything once the Revolution began. When news of Lexington and Concord reached Connecticut in April 1775, Arnold did not wait for Congress to issue careful instructions. He immediately marched with his militia toward Massachusetts, already thinking several moves ahead of most officers around him. Before the Continental Army had even fully organized itself, Arnold proposed capturing Fort Ticonderoga to seize desperately needed artillery. Working alongside Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, he helped secure one of the first major American victories of the war. It would become a pattern. Whenever Washington or Congress faced an impossible military problem, Arnold seemed drawn toward it. During the invasion of Canada later that same year, he led one of the most punishing marches in American military history through nearly 300 miles of Maine wilderness. Rain ruined gunpowder, rivers swept away supplies, starvation reduced soldiers to eating leather and candle wax. Nearly half the expedition never reached Quebec. Arnold pressed forward anyway. When an enemy musket ball shattered his leg during the assault on the city, he refused evacuation until his men had withdrawn. His superiors noticed. George Washington quickly concluded that Arnold possessed something rare. He was aggressive without becoming reckless for its own sake. He saw opportunities before other commanders recognized they existed. Most importantly, he inspired ordinary soldiers to keep advancing long after discipline alone should have failed. That reputation only grew stronger over the next 2 years. At Valcour Island in October 1776, Arnold commanded a tiny improvised American fleet on Lake Champlain against a vastly superior British naval force. He lost nearly every vessel under his command. On paper, it was a defeat. Strategically, it delayed Britain's invasion long enough to postpone the campaign until the following year, buying the Americans invaluable time to prepare. Few officers could lose a battle and still improve their country's chances of winning the war. Arnold was becoming one of them. By 1777, he had already earned a reputation as perhaps the finest battlefield commander in the Continental Army below Washington himself. Soldiers trusted him because he never asked them to go anywhere he would not personally lead. Officers respected his instinct for reading terrain and recognizing decisive moments. Even many British commanders privately acknowledged that Arnold was among the most dangerous opponents they faced. Ironically, those very qualities would soon place him on a collision course with the man who technically outranked him. By the summer of 1777, the British believed they were finally on the verge of ending the rebellion in the northern colonies. General John Burgoyne had left Canada in June with one of the most carefully organized armies Britain had assembled in North America. Nearly 8,000 men marched beneath his command. British regulars formed the backbone of the force. Thousands of disciplined German auxiliaries from Brunswick and Hesse marched beside them. Canadian loyalists, Native American allies, engineers, artillerymen, and an enormous logistical train followed behind. More than 40 cannon accompanied the expedition, along with hundreds of wagons carrying food, ammunition, tools, and equipment. Unlike many previous British campaigns, this one had been planned months in advance. Its objective was straightforward. March south along the Lake Champlain-Hudson River corridor, seize Albany, and cut New England off from the rest of the rebellious colonies. British leaders believed New England was the heart of the Revolution. If they isolated Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire from the middle and southern colonies, they expected the rebellion to collapse into disconnected regional uprisings that could be defeated one by one. On paper, the strategy made perfect sense. A second British army under Colonel Barry Street. Ledger would move east through the Mohawk Valley, while General William Howe, commanding Britain's main army in New York, was expected to move north up the Hudson. Somewhere near Albany, the three forces would meet, trapping the Continental Army between them. It looked like a classic pincer movement. Instead, it became one of the greatest failures of British strategic coordination during the entire war. Howe never marched north. Whether because of vague instructions from London, poor communication between commanders, or his own determination to capture Philadelphia, Howe instead loaded nearly 16,000 troops onto transports and sailed south. Burgoyne would not fully understand that he had been left alone until it was far too late. But in June and July of 1777, none of that was obvious. His army advanced confidently. Fort Ticonderoga, once considered America's strongest fortress, fell almost without a fight after British artillery occupied the commanding heights of Mount Defiance. American forces abandoned the position in haste, leaving behind supplies and badly damaging morale throughout the colonies. Newspapers erupted with criticism. Members of Congress questioned whether the Northern Army could stop Burgoyne at all. Every mile south seemed to confirm British confidence. Then the campaign began to slow. The geography of northern New York proved every bit as dangerous as the enemy. Roads barely deserved the name. Thick forests had to be cut apart before artillery could move forward. Bridges disappeared beneath spring floods. American militia felled massive trees across narrow roads, forcing British engineers to spend entire days clearing obstacles before wagons could continue. Streams became swamps after heavy rain. Horses died from exhaustion. Supply wagons broke axles in the mud. Instead of marching quickly toward Albany, Burgoyne's army often advanced only a mile or two in an entire day. Every delay consumed food. Every mile south stretched the supply line farther back toward Canada. The Continental Army understood exactly what was happening. General Philip Schuyler, then commanding the Northern Department, refused to offer Burgoyne the decisive battle the British wanted. Instead, American engineers destroyed bridges, blocked roads, removed livestock, evacuated civilians, and stripped the countryside of anything that could feed an invading army. It frustrated many Americans. Some politicians accused Schuyler of cowardice because he kept retreating. In reality, he was forcing Burgoyne to pay for every mile. Eventually, politics intervened. Congress replaced Schuyler with Major General Horatio Gates. Unlike Arnold, Gates was careful, methodical, and intensely political. He had cultivated influential supporters inside Congress for years and understood public opinion almost as well as military administration. Saratoga would eventually make him a national hero, but his relationship with Arnold had already become poisonous. The two men represented completely different philosophies of war. Gates believed victories came from preserving the army and forcing the enemy into unfavorable positions. Arnold believed opportunities disappeared the moment commanders hesitated. That difference might have remained manageable under ordinary circumstances. Instead, it exploded after the First Battle of Saratoga on September 19th, better known today as Freeman's Farm. When Burgoyne attempted to push through the American left, Arnold aggressively reinforced Daniel Morgan's riflemen and several Continental brigades, launching repeated counterattacks that shattered British formations throughout the afternoon. The fighting became some of the bloodiest of the campaign. Burgoyne technically held the field when darkness ended the battle, but his army had suffered nearly 600 casualties, roughly double the American losses. Many officers who fought that day believed Arnold's leadership had prevented the British from breaking through. Official reports told a different story. When Gates submitted his dispatch to Congress, Arnold's name was barely mentioned. Recognition flowed upward toward headquarters instead of outward toward the battlefield. For Arnold, whose greatest weakness had always been his fierce sense of personal honor, the omission was unbearable. Arguments that had simmered for weeks suddenly became open hostility. Inside the American camp, the commanders who needed each other most stopped trusting one another completely. Meanwhile, only a few hundred yards away, John Burgoyne was preparing one final gamble that would force both men to make decisions history would never forget. Freeman's Farm solved nothing. When the smoke cleared on September 19th, both armies still occupied their original positions. The Americans held the high ground along Bemis Heights. Burgoyne remained trapped several miles to the north, but beneath that apparent stalemate, the campaign had changed completely. British casualties could not be replaced. American casualties could. Every day brought fresh militia streaming into Gates's camp from New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. Farmers who only weeks earlier had been harvesting crops now arrived carrying muskets and powder horns, encouraged by news that Burgoyne's advance had finally been stopped. By early October, Gates commanded well over 12,000 men. Burgoyne could field barely 6,500 effectives, and even that number continued shrinking from wounds, disease, and desertion. Food was becoming an even greater problem. British rations had already been reduced. Horses were dying for lack of forage. Entire teams pulling artillery wagons collapsed on muddy roads. Every pound of flour consumed brought the army one step closer to starvation. Burgoyne faced only three realistic choices. He could retreat north toward Fort Ticonderoga. He could remain where he was and slowly run out of supplies. Or he could attack. None of the options were attractive. Retreat meant abandoning the entire campaign and admitting failure after months of marching. Remaining in place almost guaranteed disaster. That left only one possibility. He had to determine whether Gates's line contained a weakness strong enough to exploit. On October 7th, Burgoyne assembled approximately 1,500 carefully selected troops for what was officially described as a reconnaissance in force. The column included British regulars, German infantry, grenadiers, artillery, and elite light infantry under several experienced officers, among them Brigadier General Simon Fraser. Their mission was not to launch a full-scale assault. Instead, they would advance toward the American left, force Gates to reveal his dispositions, and, if an opportunity presented itself, strike hard enough to reopen the road south. It was a calculated gamble. British officers had every reason to believe they could still outfight the Continental Army in open battle. Their concern was not discipline or training, it was information. Where exactly was Gates weakest? Inside the American headquarters, reports quickly confirmed that British troops were leaving their fortified camp. The moment Arnold heard the news, he immediately recognized what Burgoyne was attempting. This was not a random skirmish. The British commander was probing for the one section of the American line that might collapse under pressure. If Gates responded too slowly, Burgoyne might discover it. Arnold urged an immediate offensive. According to several contemporary accounts, He argued that the British force should be attacked before it could properly deploy. Waiting would surrender the initiative and allow Burgoyne to choose the battlefield on his own terms. Gates refused. His strategy had worked for weeks. The British were starving. Every day they remained trapped improved the American position. Why risk a major engagement when time itself was becoming the most effective weapon? Neither man was entirely wrong. Gates understood the strategic picture. Arnold understood the tactical moment. Unfortunately for the American army, those two perspectives no longer worked together. The argument became explosive. Witnesses later described voices carrying outside headquarters as the two generals accused each other of recklessness, jealousy, and incompetence. Exactly who said what remains disputed, but the outcome is not. Gates relieved Arnold of field command. The order was unmistakable. Arnold was to remain in camp. Other officers would direct the battle. It was an extraordinary decision. Few armies willingly removed their most experienced combat commander on the very morning they expected major fighting. Yet, Gates believed discipline inside his own headquarters mattered as much as discipline on the battlefield. If a subordinate openly challenged the commanding general, the chain of command itself began to unravel. Arnold obeyed, at least physically. He remained inside camp while musket fire slowly echoed through the forest to the west. Every volley told him the battle was expanding. Every cannon shot suggested British pressure was increasing. Reports reached headquarters one after another. Daniel Morgan's riflemen had engaged the British advance. Enoch Poor's brigade was moving forward. Benjamin Lincoln's divisions were shifting position. The fighting grew louder. For Arnold, the frustration must have been almost unbearable, not because he believed someone else would receive the glory, but because he knew the battlefield better than almost anyone present. Freeman's Farm had shown him exactly how Burgoyne fought. He understood the British formations, the terrain, and the likely direction of their advance. Meanwhile, officers rode back from the front requesting reinforcements and clearer instructions. Gates continued directing operations from headquarters. His decisions were cautious, deliberate, and defensive. Arnold could hear enough to realize something else. The Americans were reacting. No one was seizing the initiative. And somewhere beyond the trees, John Burgoyne still had one chance to escape the trap that had taken months to build. Within minutes, Benedict Arnold would make a decision that violated military discipline, ignored direct orders, and ultimately transformed one of history's greatest campaigns. The battle had already begun without him. Across the rolling farmland west of Bemis Heights, Daniel Morgan's riflemen moved through the trees with practiced confidence. Unlike the tightly packed British regulars advancing across open ground, Morgan's men fought in loose formations, using every ridge, boulder, and stand of timber for cover. Their long rifles reached farther than the standard British musket, allowing them to harass officers and artillery crews before the enemy could effectively return fire. But Burgoyne's advance was no reckless charge. The British column moved with remarkable discipline. Simon Fraser commanded the right, Baron Riedessel's Germans supported the center, while General James Hamilton's regulars maintained their formation despite constant American fire. British artillery repeatedly forced Continental units to shift position, buying precious minutes for the reconnaissance force to continue its mission. This was exactly the kind of battle Burgoyne wanted. A controlled engagement. Limited objectives. Enough pressure to expose Gates's deployment without risking his entire army. For nearly an hour, the plan worked. American brigades entered the fight one after another, rather than striking together. Morgan attacked aggressively, only to find himself unsupported. General Enoch Poor's brigade pressed the British left, but struggled to coordinate with neighboring units moving through dense woods. Every commander fought well within his own sector, yet no one directed the battle as a whole. Inside headquarters, Gates continued receiving reports. Enemy advancing. American line holding. More reinforcements requested. He approved additional troop movements, but always cautiously, determined not to commit his reserves until he fully understood Burgoyne's intentions. From a strategic standpoint, the decision was understandable. From the front lines, it felt painfully slow. Arnold could no longer tolerate watching events unfold from horseback near headquarters, while others attempted to manage a battle he believed demanded immediate leadership. Accounts differ on the exact moment he snapped. Some witnesses claimed he mounted his horse after another heated exchange with Gates. Others insisted he never asked permission at all. Several officers later remembered seeing him spur his horse forward before anyone realized what he intended. What happened next is one of the most famous acts of battlefield insubordination in American military history. Without orders, without authority, without even informing headquarters where he was going, Benedict Arnold galloped straight toward the fighting. Staff officers reportedly rode after him, some carrying instructions to return immediately. Whether those orders ever reached him remains uncertain. If they did, Arnold ignored them. The moment he reached the front, something remarkable happened. Officers who technically outranked him stepped aside. Regimental commanders began asking for instructions. Soldiers who recognized him erupted with cheers. No formal transfer of command occurred. None was necessary. Arnold's authority came not from paperwork, but from reputation. Hundreds of men had already fought beside him at Quebec, Valcourt Island, Ridgefield, and Freeman's Farm. They trusted his judgment because they had survived following it before. He wasted no time. Instead of remaining behind the lines, Arnold rode continuously along the front, studying the terrain as musket balls tore through branches around him. The battlefield stretched across a patchwork of wheat fields, forests, and fences. Visibility changed every few yards. Small rises concealed entire battalions until they suddenly emerged into open ground. It was confusing terrain for coordinated maneuvers, but ideal for a commander who could rapidly identify weak points. Arnold immediately noticed something others had overlooked. The British reconnaissance force had advanced farther from Burgoyne's main camp than intended. Its flanks were increasingly exposed. Every minute spent exchanging fire with American skirmishers pulled British units farther into ground where reinforcements would be slower to arrive. Rather than reinforcing one isolated attack, Arnold envisioned something much larger. He ordered additional Continental brigades toward the British left, while encouraging Morgan's riflemen to intensify pressure against Fraser's flank. The objective was not simply to push the British backward. It was to stretch their line until it began losing cohesion. British discipline prevented panic. Again and again, companies wheeled into line, delivered controlled volleys, and repelled advancing Americans. Officers calmly dressed their ranks even as casualties mounted. Grenadiers counterattacked with bayonets, forcing several Continental units to give ground. The British Army was proving exactly why it remained one of the finest professional forces in Europe. But every successful defense carried a hidden cost. Each local counterattack required another company, another reserve, another commitment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Burgoyne's reconnaissance ceased being a reconnaissance. It was becoming a battle for survival. Arnold sensed the transition before anyone else. He realized Burgoyne was no longer probing for weakness. He was struggling simply to hold the ground already occupied. That changed everything. If the Americans continued pressing across the entire front, the British line might bend, but it probably would not break. Arnold searched for something else. One decisive point. One position whose capture would collapse the entire defense. Then, through drifting smoke beyond the fields, he saw it. Two fortified strongpoints anchored Burgoyne's right flank. The larger Balcarres redoubt dominated the position with earthworks, artillery, and experienced British infantry. Just beyond it stood the smaller Bremen redoubt, held primarily by German troops. As long as those fortifications remained connected, Burgoyne's army still possessed a defensive backbone. Destroy that connection, and the entire British position could unravel within minutes. Arnold had found the hinge upon which the entire campaign now turned. Arnold understood immediately that the larger of the two fortifications was the wrong target. The Balcarres redoubt had been built exactly as British field engineers intended. Thick earthen walls absorbed artillery fire far better than timber. Abatis, rows of sharpened trees laid outward from the works, forced attackers to slow under direct musket fire. Cannon overlooked the open approaches, while seasoned light infantry and regulars occupied protected firing positions behind the parapets. A frontal assault promised only heavy casualties. Yet from where Arnold watched the battlefield, he could also see why every American officer's attention kept drifting toward it. It dominated the landscape. As long as the Balcarres redoubt stood untouched, it looked like the center of Burgoyne's defense. But appearances were deceptive. The stronger position was also the one Burgoyne expected to defend. Arnold began looking instead for the point the British commander could least afford to lose. That point lay several hundred yards farther north. The Bremen redoubt was smaller, less complete, and separated from Balcarres by broken woodland and uneven ground that complicated mutual support. It was occupied primarily by Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Bremen's Brunswick troops, experienced soldiers, but far fewer in number than the defenders at Balcarres. If the Americans seized Bremen's position, they would not simply capture another earthwork. They would turn Burgoyne's entire right flank. The problem was getting there. Any force moving toward Bremen first had to survive the fire pouring from Balcarres. The two positions protected one another, making a direct advance extraordinarily dangerous. Most commanders would have continued battering the larger fortification, hoping sheer weight of numbers would eventually overwhelm the defenders. Arnold chose a different solution. He ordered pressure maintained against Balcarres, not because he expected it to fall, but because he wanted its garrison fully occupied. Again and again, Continental troops surged toward the earthworks. British volleys crashed into them at close range. Men fell across fences and fields. Smoke rolled over the hillside until entire companies disappeared inside it. From the British perspective, the main American effort appeared obvious. Exactly as Arnold intended. While the defenders focused their attention forward, he began shifting additional troops through the woods toward the weaker position beyond their right. The battlefield dissolved into dozens of separate fights. Daniel Morgan's riflemen worked aggressively around the British flank, picking off officers whenever they exposed themselves. Their accurate fire created confusion far beyond the number of casualties inflicted. Every experienced officer forced from the field made it harder for British companies to coordinate under growing pressure. One of the men repeatedly targeted was Brigadier General Simon Fraser. Fraser was among Burgoyne's finest battlefield commanders. Calm under fire, respected by both officers and enlisted men, he continually rode wherever the fighting became most dangerous, restoring order and directing counterattacks. His presence stabilized the British line. Morgan understood that. According to long-standing accounts, one of his riflemen, often identified as Timothy Murphy, was directed to focus on Fraser. Whether Arnold himself encouraged this decision remains uncertain, and historians continue to debate the exact sequence of events. What is clear is that Fraser became the focus of sustained American rifle fire. Eventually, a shot struck him. Mortally wounded, Fraser was carried from the battlefield as British soldiers watched one of their most trusted leaders disappear to the rear. The psychological effect was immediate. Fraser had been more than another brigadier. He had been the officer holding together the most exposed portion of Burgoyne's army. Without him, local coordination became slower. Counterattacks lost their precision. Small gaps that had previously been sealed within minutes now remained open long enough for American units to exploit them. Arnold recognized the change almost instantly. He increased the pressure. Instead of allowing individual brigades to pause and reorganize after each exchange of fire, he urged them forward before the British could restore their defensive alignment. The pace of the battle accelerated dramatically. British artillery continued firing with remarkable discipline, but ammunition was running low. Infantry companies that had spent hours under constant attack were exhausting their cartridges. Officers struggled to replace casualties while maintaining coherent formations across increasingly fragmented terrain. Even so, Burgoyne's army did not collapse. Again and again, British regulars formed new lines under fire. German infantry stood their ground despite mounting losses. The defense remained stubborn, organized, and dangerous. But Arnold had succeeded in forcing Burgoyne into exactly the kind of battle the British commander had hoped to avoid. Instead of probing the American line on his own terms, Burgoyne was now committing every available reserve simply to prevent his right flank from breaking. The initiative had completely changed hands. As the afternoon wore on, Arnold no longer saw the Balcarres redoubt as the objective. It had become an anchor. The real decision would be made at Bremen. If that smaller fortification fell, nothing behind it could prevent the Americans from rolling up the British line from the flank. Without waiting for further instructions, or any permission at all, Arnold gathered the nearest available troops and pointed them directly toward the weakest link in Burgoyne's defense. Within minutes, both armies would discover that the fate of an entire campaign rested on a single unfinished redoubt. Arnold did not wait for the battlefield to settle. He knew the opportunity would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. The gap between the Balcarres and Bremen redoubts was still narrow enough for British officers to believe they could hold it. Another 30 minutes of organized resistance might allow Burgoyne to withdraw in good order before darkness. If that happened, the British army would survive, bloodied, exhausted, but intact. Arnold intended to make sure that never happened. Riding directly behind the leading Continental troops, he drove them toward the unfinished defenses surrounding Bremen's position. The ground itself worked against the attackers. Fallen trees, split-rail fences, dense undergrowth, and uneven slopes shattered formations before they even reached musket range. Companies that had begun the advance shoulder to shoulder arrived at the earthworks in scattered groups. Normally, such disorder favored the defenders. Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Bremen's Brunswick soldiers fought with remarkable discipline. Though heavily outnumbered, they held their fire until the Americans closed the distance, then unleashed coordinated volleys that ripped through the advancing Continentals. Several attacks stalled almost immediately. Officers trying to rally their men became prime targets. Smoke drifted through the trees so thickly that commands often disappeared before reaching the next company. For several minutes, the assault seemed on the verge of failing. Arnold refused to let it. Instead of remaining behind the lines where most major generals directed operations, he rode straight into the zone of fire, appearing wherever the attack seemed closest to breaking. Witnesses later recalled seeing him point toward openings in the defenses, wave fresh companies forward, and personally redirect confused units that had lost contact with their officers. His presence created momentum that formal orders could not. Continental soldiers had followed Arnold through impossible situations before. Seeing him in front rather than behind them erased hesitation. Units that had begun falling back turned around and advanced again. The pressure on Bremen's position steadily increased. Inside the redoubt, the defenders faced a growing problem. The earthwork had never been designed to withstand an attack from multiple directions at once. As more American troops worked their way around the flanks through the surrounding woods, Bremen's soldiers were forced to spread thinner along the perimeter. Every section reinforced to stop one assault weakened another. Meanwhile, Burgoyne searched desperately for reserves. There were almost none left. Hours of continuous fighting had consumed the very troops he had hoped to preserve. Companies that should have remained available for emergencies were already committed along the line. Officers requested reinforcements that simply did not exist. The reconnaissance in force had become exactly what Burgoyne had hoped to avoid, a full-scale engagement that exhausted his last operational reserve. Then the decisive moment arrived. American troops found a weak section near the edge of the unfinished works. Whether the opening resulted from incomplete construction, mounting casualties, or the simple confusion of battle remains uncertain. What mattered was that, for the first time all afternoon, the defenders could no longer maintain a continuous line of fire. Arnold saw it instantly. He urged the nearest regiments forward before the gap could be sealed. The attack hit with overwhelming speed. Continental soldiers surged over the outer obstacles and poured into the redoubt. Fighting immediately dissolved into brutal close-quarters combat. Muskets became clubs after firing. Bayonets flashed through clouds of powder smoke. Officers struggled to distinguish friend from foe as formations collapsed into isolated groups battling only a few yards apart. Bremen attempted to rally his men. He was killed during the fighting. With their commander dead and Americans appearing inside the fortification itself, organized resistance began to disintegrate. Within minutes, the redoubt was lost. Its capture transformed the entire battlefield. Until that moment, Burgoyne's defensive line had remained anchored on both ends. Once Bremen fell, the right flank ceased to exist. American troops immediately began firing into positions that had previously faced only forward. British units defending neighboring sectors suddenly found themselves attacked from the side and rear. No commander can comfortably hold a line that's being rolled up from one end. Burgoyne recognized the danger immediately. He ordered a withdrawal toward his main camp before the entire army became encircled. British regulars carried out the retreat with impressive discipline despite the chaos around them. Companies covered one another's movement, artillery crews withdrew guns whenever possible, and officers prevented what could easily have become a complete rout. Their professionalism almost certainly saved the army from total destruction that afternoon. But the campaign itself had been mortally wounded. Then, in the middle of the victory he had done more than anyone else to create, Arnold's extraordinary ride came to an abrupt end. As he drove deeper toward the retreating British positions, a musket ball struck his left leg. The same leg that had been shattered during the assault on Quebec nearly 2 years earlier. His horse collapsed beneath him, pinning the wounded general to the ground. For a few terrifying moments, Arnold lay exposed between the lines as bullets continued to pass overhead. Soldiers rushed forward and finally pulled both horse and rider clear. His injury was severe enough that some feared the leg would have to be amputated. Arnold had led the decisive attack. He had broken the British flank. And now, unable to stand, he watched the battle continue without him. By nightfall, Burgoyne's army had fallen back into an increasingly desperate defensive position. Its last realistic chance to regain the initiative had vanished. Only one decision remained: whether to attempt the impossible or surrender an entire British army. By the morning of October 8, 1777, John Burgoyne understood that the campaign he had spent months building was finished. His army had survived the fighting at Bemis Heights, but survival was no longer enough. The right flank had been shattered. More than 600 additional casualties had been suffered in a single afternoon. Brigadier General Simon Fraser, one of Burgoyne's most capable commanders, was dying from his wounds. Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Breyman was dead. The carefully organized reconnaissance that had begun as an attempt to locate an American weakness had instead exposed the British Army's own vulnerability. Worse still, time had run out. Food stores were nearly exhausted. Rain had turned roads into mud once again. American militia continued arriving from every direction, tightening the ring around Burgoyne's shrinking position. Retreat, once difficult, was becoming nearly impossible. That evening, Burgoyne called his senior officers together. The discussion was brutally honest. Could they attack again? No. Could they remain where they were? Not without starving. Could they break north toward Fort Ticonderoga? Perhaps, but only if the Americans failed to block the roads first. There was only one option left. The British Army began withdrawing toward Saratoga, hoping to escape before Gates could cut off the final route north. The movement came too late. American forces quickly occupied the abandoned positions and advanced aggressively. Bridges were seized, crossings were blocked, militia flooded into the surrounding countryside, cutting communications and intercepting supply wagons. Burgoyne soon discovered that the roads behind him were no more secure than the battlefield he had just left. Within days, nearly 6,000 British and German soldiers found themselves surrounded. The army that had crossed the Canadian border with confidence 4 months earlier had nowhere left to go. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne formally surrendered. It remains one of the most consequential capitulations in military history. More than 5,700 British and German troops laid down their arms before the Continental Army. For the young United States, it was far more than a battlefield victory. Until Saratoga, European governments had watched the American Revolution with caution. Many admired the colonists' determination, but few believed they could actually defeat Britain's professional army. Isolated victories could be dismissed as temporary setbacks. The destruction of an entire British field army could not. News crossed the Atlantic in the autumn of 1777. In Paris, it landed on the desks of ministers who had been waiting for exactly this proof. France had secretly supplied money, weapons, and ammunition to the Americans for months, but committing openly against Britain was an entirely different matter. Such a decision meant risking another global war. Saratoga changed the calculation. If the Continental Army could destroy one of Britain's best armies without direct French intervention, perhaps the rebellion could actually succeed. On February 6, 1778, France signed the Treaty of Alliance with the United States. French money expanded. French troops would eventually sail across the Atlantic. Most importantly, the French Navy entered the war. Britain suddenly faced conflict not only in North America, but across Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and India. Resources that might have crushed the revolution instead had to be divided across a global empire. Many historians have argued that without Saratoga, there would have been no French alliance. Without the French alliance, there may never have been a victory at Yorktown. And without Yorktown, American independence becomes far more difficult to imagine. One afternoon of fighting in the forests outside Saratoga had altered the balance of power across the Atlantic. Yet inside the American camp, another story was unfolding. Public recognition flowed overwhelmingly toward Horatio Gates. As commanding general, he received official congratulations from Congress. Newspapers celebrated his leadership. Portraits were commissioned. Some politicians even whispered that Gates, not George Washington, might be the man best suited to lead the war. Benedict Arnold received something very different. Another shattered leg. Months of painful recovery. And growing resentment. Although many officers who had fought at Bemis Heights openly acknowledged Arnold's decisive role, official reports minimized his contribution. Gates's dispatches emphasized the Army's collective success, while giving little attention to the general who had ridden into battle without orders and led the attacks that broke Burgoyne's line. The irony is impossible to ignore. At Saratoga, Benedict Arnold reached the highest point of his military career. He displayed extraordinary tactical judgment. He inspired exhausted soldiers to attack again and again. He identified the single weak point that collapsed an entire British position. And he did it after being stripped of command. Within 3 years, however, the same man would become the most infamous traitor in American history, attempting to surrender West Point to the British Crown. History rarely produces contradictions this stark. The officer who helped secure the victory that convinced France to join the revolution would later try to help Britain win that very same war. That contradiction has often overshadowed Saratoga itself. But if we judge October 7th, 1777, only by what happened on that battlefield, the conclusion is difficult to escape. Benedict Arnold did not merely participate in one of the revolution's greatest victories. At the moment when hesitation threatened to preserve Burgoyne's army, he recognized the decisive point, seized the initiative, and transformed a hard-fought engagement into a strategic disaster for Britain. Sometimes history turns because armies are larger. Sometimes because supplies last longer. And sometimes because one commander chooses to ignore the order that would have kept him safely out of the fight. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more deep dives into the battles and decisions that changed history. And tell us in the comments, do you think Saratoga was won primarily by Benedict Arnold's battlefield leadership or by Horatio Gates's overall strategy? We'd also love to know where you're watching from.